What is the real lesson of 9/11? The lesson that unfortunately all too many members of the mainstream media are not learning? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle. The show, as you all know, brings you the principled and uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy, especially within the burning context, within the context of the burning issues of the day. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you too, as we're now approaching, into the ninth month of the Biden administration.
Yeah, and so how do you feel about that? Feel free?
Well, I after these tax laws are passed, I'll feel freer in terms of less weight of money in my pocket.
All right. Well, if you're new to the Future of Freedom Foundation, subscribe to our FFF journal. That's Future of Freedom, which brings you principled and compromising essays every month. Subscribe to our FFF Daily. Be sure to tune in on our Civil Liberties Conference. We had the first talk last night by Tom Palmer, an absolutely excellent way to kick off the conference. Tom gave a historical description of the origins of civil liberty. It was absolutely fantastic. And we'll be posting that probably early next week. And then next Tuesday, we proceed with the second lecture in the series by Stephen Hallbrook, who's going to be talking about what some people would consider the most important civil liberty, and that's the right to keep and bear arms. And then, of course, subscribe to this YouTube channel. Okay, so Richard, we just experienced the commemoration or anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. And so I thought, well, it's important that we revisit that. You know, we've already talked about the Afghanistan debacle, but, you know, and they're absolutely intertwined with each other. But I think it's important to focus in on this 9/11 matter, because it's clear that very few people have really learned the lesson here. I mean, when I was reading all these opinions and commentaries and op-eds and so forth, I mean, there's still this notion that the terrorists just came and attacked America for its freedom and values because they hate America for its freedom and values. Or some people implicitly sort of look at it like the coronavirus, that, terrorism is a virus that hits different parts of the world, and oh gosh, woe is us. It finally reached America, and we have just no choice but to respond now with this global war on terrorism. Well, all of this is just nonsense. It's a way to avoid confronting the role of the U.S. government in precipitating these attacks, and specifically with respect to foreign policy. And that's what I'd like to focus in on as an introduction to this segment of Libertarian Angle. That there, before 9/11, we were predicting here at FFF that there was going to be a major terrorist attack on American soil. We weren't the only ones. There was Chalmers Johnson, who wrote that fantastic book called Blowback: The Costs and Consequences of American Empire, where he said the same thing. And Ron Paul said it in that famous presidential debate where they skewered him. I mean, they just went ballistic on him because he said, we need to acknowledge that they came over here and killed us because we, meaning the U.S. government, has been over there killing people in the Middle East. And man, boy, you just would have thought that a nuclear bomb had gone off the way they reacted. Oh, you're trying to blame America and all this. No, we're just looking at motive. You know, and when prosecutors go into a courtroom to prosecute a person, they examine motive. You know, what motivated this guy to do this? And they talk to the jury about that. Well, that doesn't mean they're defending it or they're blaming America or anything like that. They're saying this is what led these people to get so angry that they responded. Now, why is that an important lesson? Well, because by understanding what motivates people to do these kind of deadly, dastardly things, you might be able to figure out, hey, maybe we should stop doing that as a way to stop the retaliation. You know, the notion is sometimes among interventionists is that foreigners are different from Americans, that you can kill as many foreigners as you want and they won't get angry about it. They won't want to retaliate. Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, look how Americans reacted after 9/11. I mean, everybody was ready for vengeance. You know, let's go in there in Afghanistan, let's go in there in Iraq, and let's kill as many of those Muslims as we can, because there were those that were saying this is a war against Islam, and this is a war against that is to establish a caliphate, worldwide caliphate. So you had all this anti-Islamic sentiment when very few people wanted to listen to what we had to say 20 years ago, that look at what motivated them. Because if it's foreign intervention that motivated them, and it was, then maybe we ought to stop the foreign interventionism. And that's the crux of the lesson here. That if you want to stop the threat of terrorist blowback, terrorist retaliation, just stop what's motivating them. Now, if you were doing something that was worthwhile, you might think to yourself, well, this is too important, I'm not going to stop it. But if it's something that's not worthwhile, then it's time to stop it. And that's the lesson we were given post 9/11. That was when we were being vilified. I've never seen so much hate mail coming in, subscription cancellations, donation cancellations, because I shouldn't say nobody, very few people wanted to home in on what the real cause of the motivation here was, what the Pentagon and the CIA had been doing in the Middle East, at least since the time they lost their official empire, their official enemy, which was the Soviet Empire, with the end of the Cold War. Because following that, you had the Persian Gulf intervention, you had the brutal sanctions on Iraq that were killing hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children, you had the intentional destruction of the water and sewage treatment plants in Iraq with the intent to spread infectious illnesses among the populace. You had Madeleine Albright, the official spokesman for the United States and the United Nations. She was the ambassador there. She announced that the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children, while difficult, had been worth it. She wasn't even mildly criticized by any official in Washington, including her boss, President Clinton, because they undoubtedly agreed with her sentiment. You had the unconditional support for the Israeli government, no matter what it was doing to Palestinians. You had the U.S. troops occupying Saudi Arabia near the holiest lands in the Islamic religion. How could U.S. officials not know what the reaction of that would be? And then, of course, you had the terrorist attacks that preceded 9/11. You had the attack in 1993 on the World Trade Center, which was no different from the later one on the World Trade Center. The USS Cole, the embassies in East Africa. That's the lesson here that people are not getting, that it was U.S. foreign policy that led to these attacks, and that's the lesson we have to keep emphasizing at this point, Richard. What do you think?
Well, I think it's worth pointing out a number of things. First of all, when people with our views would say, it's America that ends up either being threatened or suffering from attempted terrorist attacks, whereas other countries are not. I mean, does anyone try to, kill people in Copenhagen or Amsterdam? And people would just poo-poo that. And then they would say, but look, now they're bombing a train in Spain. You had this mass murder a few years ago on the streets of Paris. You've had beheadings of people in France, a priest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But why? Only after the United States had invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, and especially with Afghanistan because of the NATO connection, Western European countries now had troops alongside, obviously in smaller contingent numbers, but as a symbolic statement of unity with the United States, troops, another type of military related personnel in Afghanistan. And now the French and the British and the Spanish and many other citizens of European countries were now a target because they now were viewed as the same as the United States, intervening into their country, into their religious part of the world. And the attacks came back to them too. You mentioned the other day, how you just mentioned a minute ago, how many people didn't angrily responded to the case for non-interventionism in the context of 9/11. Like many people who were alive 20 years ago, I remember where I was when 9/11 occurred. I was in Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia, attending the annual meeting of the Free Market Montpellerin Society. And I came back to my room after a social outing that the conference organizers had. And I turned on the television and I suddenly see the second plane smash into the second of the Twin Towers. And at first I thought I was watching some sci-fi movie with special effects. And then I realized I'm watching CNN. This is live. And then shortly after that, the vibrations occur and the buildings just collapse in a matter of moments. And that evening, the dinner at the conference was very somber, Jacob, not surprisingly. And Father Robert Sirico of the Acton Institute in Grand Rapids, Michigan, gave up and made some remarks of the most appropriate and timely and ecumenical type about the importance of freedom and justice and compassion, even in the face of our shock and anger. But then after dinner, the participants broke up, in various little circles in the hotel lobby, in the bar, and invariably, why? What should be done? And especially, though not exclusively, the Americans, almost to a person, attack, revenge, teach them a lesson. They've gone after us because they hate our values. And I and a very small number of others slightly and politely beg to differ, that no matter how unjustifiable these acts were, which had caused the deaths of thousands of innocent men and women and maybe a few children, and the physical destruction, we have to ask ourselves, why would these people have been driven to do this? And as you were suggesting, I and a few of the other participants in these after dinner discussions over a drink suggested that it had to do with decades of American foreign interventionism. I reminded people, and a few of the others reminded people there, that there's an old adage: the friend of my enemy is my enemy. And whenever the United States intervenes in another land, politically, economically, and certainly militarily, invariably the U.S. picks one of the political groups or the power in power, the group in power or out of power, and that means that the other group that we're not supporting views us the enemy because we're throwing our weight behind the group, the party, the faction that they're in a political or even sometimes a civil war conflict with. And do not therefore be surprised when those who view us as supporting their opponents may sometimes resort to violent means. And this is what basically happened. If you read the public missives by bin Laden, Osama bin Laden, and others of that circle, what did they basically complain about? Did they say they hate America because of the Gillette razor company and threatening the beards of Muslims? No. What they said is what they hated was America militarily intervening and stationing troops in a country that is the host of the most sacred sites of the Muslim religion, Mecca and Medina, and that the United States was propping up what Osama bin Laden and those of his ideological and theological persuasion viewed as a corrupt and decadent government, and that therefore we were the enemy against their faith in their part of the world. And as a consequence, as you said, there was the attempt to blow up the USS Cole in the port of Aden. There were attacks on the embassies in East Africa. There was the foiled attempt in 1993, as you said, to try to bring down one of the trade towers in New York City. And then finally, the success of these hijackers who boarded and gained control of these airplanes and crashed into the trade towers, crashed into a segment of the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and would have crashed into another building in Washington, D.C., if not for the armed uprising, clearly, as we have now attempted to reconstruct, of the passengers on another plane that overpowered the terrorists, but in the process brought the plane down and crashed, killing the terrorists, but alas, all of the passengers on that plane as well. And this is why. This is a pattern. Why is it that the Iranians hate us? Yes, you could say, oh, they're Muslim fanatics, with their particular reading of the Quran. But is there not the history of the United States and the British overthrowing a government in 1953? Was there not the United States for decades bolstering with military and economic assistance the Shah, who was ruling his country as a dictator, arresting and torturing people? Now, that is in no way defending the policies or the ideology of Ayatollah Khomeini, who came to power after 1979 with the overthrow of the Shah. But it doesn't change the fact, okay, it does not change the fact that these individuals, these groups, view the United States as intervening in their parts of the world, in their countries, and choosing to support a side of which they are the opponents. And if we're the people who are propping up their enemies, don't be surprised if they turn their weapons on us. And I really want to highly emphasize, which I was doing then, and I know you too, and now, to look at the motive is not the same thing as justifying or apologizing for it. If you know, the police look for method, motive, and opportunity. Could this person have done it? Did he have the opportunity to do it? And why would he have done it? That's looked by the prosecution, right? Not the defense trying to justify anything, but the prosecution, right? This guy had a grudge against Joe. He had the physical implement to use to hit Joe over the head and crack his skull, and we're able to show that he didn't have an alibi for the time when Joe was killed at location X. And you know what? The person we are accusing seemed to leave a lot of footprints, and he can't explain where he was during the window of opportunity. And the jury decides whether the evidence is strong enough. But you look for motive, as you were saying, Jacob. Is that not true in a court of law? Yes. So the thing is that explaining why they did this and what motivated them does not change the fact, that they did this for a reason. And as long as the United States chooses to militarily intervene in the world, and invariably supporting dictators and tyrants, and justifying and rationalizing their use of our military and economic aid to often oppress their own people, that was the practice throughout the Cold War period. You know, there was NATO and quote the West, of which the U.S. was the leader, and then there was the Soviet bloc, and then there was what was called the Third World, supposedly the non-aligned countries of Asia, Africa, Latin America. And for decades during the Cold War, if there was some dictator in Africa or Asia who said that he was anti-communist, no matter how brutal he was, the military and economic aid came his way, and suddenly he was labeled part of the free world. Free world? Tell that to the people who might have had nothing to do with any local communist insurgency, but opposed the tyrant for even liberal freedom reasons, who ended up being arrested, tortured, imprisoned, killed by the tyrant. Why should you expect these people not to resent what the United States does? And this is what was behind it. So as long as America follows this path, and we've not seen any but this lesson, and if you allow me just another minute, Jacob, I too have been reading these commentaries since the debacle of the evacuation out of Kabul. And what are most of the commentaries saying? The mainstream media. Will our allies trust us in the future? Will our opponents like China and Russia, will they see us weak and try to aggressively take advantage and gain their own positions in the world? Will Americans, in the face of another disaster like Vietnam, be willing to support the U.S. government politically and militarily the next time we have to intervene? That's the default position. This is the right course, and America can't step down from it. And we just have to be worried, as if we have symbolically shown weakness, and we can get the American people behind us once again when we have to incur another adventure abroad. This is the wrong lessons to be learned. In fact, I would argue the exact opposite. But again, why would you expect anything different? Are these not the people in the government bureaucracies who feed off? It's their rice bowl. to be part of the military establishment, the foreign policy State Department establishment. Need I mention all of the private sector industries and companies that live at the trough of government spending on the basis of this largesse of defense expenditures? In the fiscal government budget that begins October 1, the Biden administration is going to be spending over $750 billion on defense-related activities. That's a lot of money to be made by the private sector companies who live off that as their revenues, as the net tax receivers in society. And we should not be surprised that there is this huge contingent of interest groups in the bureaucracy and in the private sector who benefit from an interventionist foreign policy. And they're part of the rationales for staying that course.
Yeah, I find it interesting that they're out of Afghanistan and they're not reducing the military budget at all. They're, they're asking for the same amount, if not more, than what they were receiving when they were using up all those bombs and missiles and bullets and armored personnel carriers and the like. Richard, on your point about motive, it really is important that we emphasize this, because that's the big lesson here. That we've got to understand the reason. Take, for example, some guy came to you and said, "I'm going to kill you," and let's say or kills a member of your family, and you immediately say, "I'm going to get revenge." Okay, I can understand that feeling, but wouldn't you want to know why he was so angry at you? I mean, suppose you take the time to say, well, excuse me, why are you trying to kill me? Why are you killing my family members? What if the guy were to say, well, because you've been insulting my wife every day at work? Well, now let's assume you really were insulting her. You might sit there and say, you know what? It's not worth it for me to continue insulting his wife. I mean, he's going to keep killing me. We're going to have this vengeance thing going on. I think I'll just stop insulting his wife. Much simpler thing. Well, that's why it's important to look at motive, because you might sit here and say, okay, we acknowledge that foreign interventionism is the problem here. And that would be a big victory in and of itself if everybody in America acknowledged that. Then we could rationally start debating, is it worth it? Is the foreign interventionism worth not only the threats of anti-American terrorism, but all the infringements on liberty, the destruction of liberty that takes place as a result of that, to protect us from these terrorists? And so this was the real dark irony of Afghanistan and Iraq, is that instead of examining the motive here, they just went headlong and did more in a massive way of what had motivated the people to attack in the first place. So that's where your global war on terrorism became an even greater feeding trough for the people you're talking about in the private sector that feed at this national security establishment trough. That by going into Afghanistan and then Iraq, you're doing more of the same thing that motivated the attack in the first place. So you have generated your own gravy train here, because you're killing more and more people on a continuous basis. There's that anger and that rage that says, okay, we're coming after you to retaliate. They retaliate like the would-be bomber in Detroit, or the Fort Hood bomber, or the people out in California, or the people, Florida or wherever. And then the government says, you see, we really do have a terrorist problem. They really do hate us for our freedom and values. We need to clamp down on your liberties even more, and we need to attack and kill more people overseas. The war on terrorism becomes self-generating. I remember describing this process as the greatest terrorist-producing machine in history, because their own machinery was producing the terrorism that they then used to expand budgets and influence and power and take away our own freedoms. And your point about what bin Laden was saying was absolutely right on. I mean, he was using the occupation of Saudi Arabia as his driving force there. But if you go back to one of the terrorists in the 93 attack on the World Trade Center, a guy named Ramzi Youssef, this guy's at his federal sentencing hearing. He's been convicted of terrorism in the 93 attack on the World Trade Center. He tells the federal judge, you call us a terrorist? You guys are the butchers. You're the ones killing all those children in Iraq. And so you've got anger and rage there. I mean, imagine if, look how angry Americans got after 9/11, and rightfully so. But what if people had been killing American children on a continuous basis for 11 years or 5 years or whatever? I think they've been going on about 3 years when Youssef was talking to that judge. I mean, you don't think people would be horribly outraged at innocent children being killed? Uh, I think it's also important to address some of the other arguments on this thing, specifically the truther arguments. You know, the people have been saying from the beginning that this was an inside job by the federal government, and you've got some really stout architects and engineers saying this, and I'm not an engineer, Richard. I can't make that judgment. To me, the foreign policy motivation looks to me just right on, that that U.S. officials callously look the other way. It's the law calls conscious disregard of the consequences. But I have to say, I'm not in a position to judge that. But I will say this, that I noticed that the people that criticize that concept never point to Operation Northwoods. And Operation Northwoods really needs to be examined. Nobody's ever discussed this or debated it in the mainstream press. It popped up in the 90s, and everybody just sort of ignored it. This is a phenomenal operation where the Pentagon unanimously, the Joint Chiefs of Staff unanimously presented to President Kennedy a plan to create a justification for invading Cuba. And that plan called for terrorist attacks on American soil where real people were going to be killed. They were expendable, and there were going to be plane hijackings. And the president's job was to go on TV and say, we've been attacked by the Cuban communists, even though he knew that they were secretly U.S. agents doing this. This is a real plan that was uncovered in the 1990s. I think that has to be addressed here, that the Joint Chiefs of Staff were actually willing to do that. And I think it's also incumbent on the president to release all the investigative reports, especially on Saudi Arabia. None of those 19 hijackers were Afghans. They were 19 of them, I think, were Saudi citizens. The idea of keeping secret the investigation of 9/11 as it oriented towards Saudi Arabia, we know that's a crooked regime. We know it's a murderous regime. Look what happened to Khashoggi, at the Washington Post writer. This is a brutal regime. Their intelligence apparatus is brutal. Why is the U.S. trying to do its best to cover up the investigation as it orients to that regime? If that regime was involved, we should know about that. And so I wanted to bring up those things as well.
Well, just let me reinforce that is, right after 9/11, George W. Bush said that he was forming an Office of Homeland Security. That is a surveillance, investigative, intrusive department, bureau in the U.S. government to fight terrorism, which of course soon after that was made into a cabinet level Department of Homeland Security. This too is part of the consequences, Jacob. The establishment of basically an immense and intrusive and dangerous surveillance state in the United States, reading our email, following the keystrokes on our computer screen, computer laptops, intercepting our voice conversations, certainly globally, even internally, and the idea that Americans are to turn on each other and to be potentially informers. If you think of anything suspicious, you see somebody doing something, or someone seems to look funny, report to the U.S. government. In other words, everybody's made an informer, like in a communist country or in Nazi Germany. You will inform the Gestapo whenever you see anything that is against the regime. I mean, obviously, the United States is not the Nazi regime, if you think of the imagery of that. But the fact that it's a mindset, it's an attitude, it's the creating of a presumption that it is the duty of the American citizen to turn his neighbors into the U.S. government, not because you see something real happening or a clear and present typical threat to another, but a suspicion, a doubt. He doesn't look right. He seems to be moving strangely. You just think he's weird, and weirdness means he could be one of those outliers who's going to be the lone nut. This is a dangerous thing to do. It has enabled the United States government to kill both home and foreign individuals under the capricious decision of a president. It has resulted in this emergence of a drone war, far more than had existed certainly before 9/11. There's a drone war in which the U.S. has the ability, like a video game, to have a pilot steer a drone with the capacity to drop a missile on people in another country with neither the government of that country or any advance notice, and being totally uncertain who you're targeting. There's this case that's become, in the news with the day before America's full withdrawal from Kabul, where a drone attack killed what seemed to have been not a terrorist, part of the Taliban, but a possible aid worker and several members of his family. And then the United States is supposed to not be is not supposed to be is supposed to be surprised when these people react that America is the killer. There was the exchange between Rand Paul and Secretary of State Blinken in Congress just yesterday, in which Rand Paul asked him bluntly, can you confirm that this fellow who the drone was targeting was a Taliban suspect that was on a hit list for the United States, or an innocent aid worker who got killed along with family members? And what was Blinken? We're looking into it. We take these matters seriously. Can you confirm one way or the other? No, I really can't, but we're looking into it. These people just whitewash their how else can you put it? Criminal activities. What if the United States was sending drones under the suspicion of someone in an American city and ended up killing what others considered likely to be an innocent person and members of his family? Would that not cause a bit of a controversy? But as long as it's in another part of the world, those people are fair game, regardless of the rationale, justification, or the factual reasonableness of what lies behind the attack.
Yeah, there's like a relative indifference to the lives of these foreigners. They're not like Americans, where American life is sacred. And then if there is retaliation for that, let's say a family member goes out and commits a suicide bombing or something. Oh, you see, he just hates us for our freedom and values. And I'm glad you pointed out the whole homeland security, because this is what foreign interventionism did, Richard. It leads to 9/11 with the motivation there. And as you pointed out earlier, the great beneficiaries of this are the Pentagon, the CIA, the national security establishment, the defense contractors, the subcontractors. I mean, they all benefited from this with huge amounts of tax-funded largesse. And then they use that as the excuse to have this Homeland Security Agency, this overall surveillance state, this intrusive airport security. I mean, you and I both know what it was like to just go to the airport before 9/11. You didn't have any of the security problem. That's another cost of this foreign interventionism. And let me wrap up this segment by pointing to Switzerland. Notice that the terrorists are not attacking Switzerland, and Switzerland's really closer to them than we are. But Switzerland never went into Afghanistan. They never went into Iraq. They weren't imposing sanctions on Iraq. They didn't get involved in the Persian Gulf War. They really have the ideal foreign policy. Everything is oriented toward legitimate defense, not the kind of defense that U.S. officials use when they cite defense and the Department of Defense. It's really the Department of Interventionism. Switzerland, everybody knows where he's supposed to go in the event of an emergency. I think practically every family is armed. Every man knows what his assignment is. Every woman is in case of an invasion. Nobody jacks with the Swiss. Even Hitler didn't jack with the Swiss because they know it'd be like swallowing a porcupine. That's our foreign policy. That's the model right there. And that really was the U.S. foreign policy for more than 100 years. And if we restore that foreign policy, end non-interventionism, open the borders and let the American people travel and trade anywhere in the world they want, lift all the sanctions and the embargoes, that is the key to a free, prosperous, harmonious, and moral society, Richard.
And I'll just add one concluding remark, is that the world has become highly Americanized. They like our movies, They listen to our music. They wear our fashion styles. They have an image of wanting to have the American quality of lifestyle. Uh, why haven't there been terrorist attacks about that? Because these are peaceful things. You can either listen to American music or watch American movies. You can wear the dress styles of Americans or not. But the U.S., when it intervenes, when the U.S. government intervenes, it imposes military and political and economic pressures and force in ways that cause the resentment that buying a music video or watching a music video does not.
Okay, on that note, we'll wrap it up. Richard, enjoyed the conversation, and thank you for tuning in. Again, be sure to tune in, register for our Civil Liberties Conference. It resumes next Tuesday evening with Stephen Holbrook on the Second Amendment, right to keep and bear arms. Subscribe to our FFF Daily. That'll keep you apprised of our conference and other matters. And subscribe to our monthly journal. And if you like our work, go ahead and send us a donation. We'd be very appreciative. Richard, enjoy the visit, and I'll see you next week.
Until next week.